Conor McReynolds, and welcome to the dinner party. In this podcast, I ask guests to tell me about their dream dinner parties. I want to know all about the venue, the menu, and the guest list. These conversations always get to the core of people's creativity and passions. I just love them. This week, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by John Hoggarth. John is the co-director at Oxford's stunning North Wall Arts Centre, having previously been in charge of the National Youth Theatre. John's also worked extensively in comedy and is really passionate about making the arts accessible for young people and people who otherwise may not have had access to opportunities. He's a fascinating guy and he's put together an absolute belter of a dinner party. You're going to love this one. So without further ado, here is the fantastic John Hoggarth. John Hoggarth, thank you so much for joining me on the dinner party. How are you?
Very well, thank you, Connor.
It's such a pleasure to be speaking to you. I've been really excited about our chat. John, you're co-director at the beautiful North Wall in Oxford. So tell us about what that role entails, and I guess particularly it must be a challenge in a year that's been so disruptive to live performance.
Yeah, well, I mean, first off, you're absolutely right. You mentioned the beautiful space of the North Wall, and we've myself and Ria have been co-directors there for the last nearly 3 years now. This last year has obviously been a very different experience to the previous two, but we're very. I mean, we're really excited to be part of the North Wall and its history. And I say in terms of the pandemic and those sort of things, we've had to adjust massively. And because of the nature of the work we do at the North Wall, some of the things that we've been able to do have kind of continued. So unfortunately, the programme has suffered a great deal in terms of what we're showing to the public. But actually, we've managed to maintain quite a lot of the research and development work that we do and the artist development work that we do. So in some ways, although it's been a very different year, hopefully we've maintained some work throughout that, and we've managed to retain all our staff and all that kind of thing. So we've, compared to many theatres, hopefully we've survived okay.
That's really remarkable. In terms of the kind of day-to-day role itself, I mean, this year being a bit of an anomaly, but in a kind of COVID-free world, is your role, a very creative one, or is it more sort of strategic and programming? What does a kind of, well, I guess if you were a solo artistic director, it might be a broader remit, but you do have this working relationship with Ria as well. So how does that partnership work?
Yeah, so it's. I mean, we're both co-directors, so we both have both artistic and executive responsibility for the building and that type of thing. So it does involve, kind of the executive, and that's kind of the finance and those sort of things, but also in terms of the artistic policy going forward. So whether that's to do with the programming of what shows end up in the theatre, or actually the kind of output of work that we do, we've got kind of a hand in all of that as well. Ria and I have never worked together as co-directors before. We once had
Oh, wow.
an experience of directing a production together, which wasn't the best experience for either of us. but actually, in terms of co-director role, it's very different because there is quite a clear delineation in terms of what we take responsibility for, and from the off we've been very clear about kind of our roles within the responsibility. So although we both have joint responsibility as co-directors, we very much know where our strengths are and what we can bring to each of those roles.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of but because your background is very much in obviously in the arts and theater, you've written a lot, you've directed a lot. How does a role, a kind of executive role, obviously with huge creative elements, but how does it differ from the what people may know as a kind of traditional theater director role?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big differences, and one of the things that I had to get my head around when I moved from kind of being a director of a production into an artistic director role, and now with this, a co-director role, which also has executive responsibility, is that they are very different jobs, one from the other. So, as a production director, you are very much focused on that particular story, the group and the team that you're working with, and that's
Mm-hmm.
your focus. And it's about making that work and delivering the performance of production, on time. As an
Mm-hmm.
artistic director, I think it's a much more strategic role that you have. So it's, you're working much more like in some ways a producer, where you're trying to develop, well, who comes into this building, what sort of work do we do, what are the things that we're aiming to achieve, what's our kind of vision for things. And you have to have that kind of much more overview, strategic view on things.
Mm.
And then as a co-director, in terms of executive responsibility, you're also battling with the notion of how do we pay for all of this. So as an
Yes.
artistic director, you can sometimes, kind of make real demands on your exec director to say, well, look, this is what we're going to do. This is what I believe in. But what I find, what Rhea and I are finding, is we've got to balance that enthusiasm with, a dose of reality as well, of what can be achieved and what can be achieved that doesn't potentially bankrupt us. And I think all theatres are facing, that particular dilemma more than ever at the moment.
Yeah, it sounds like an incredibly challenging set of plates to keep spinning, satisfying the creative wants with what's practical, and I guess particularly this year, kind of a healthy dose of caution in there. I mean, you mentioned that you've kept work going, that you've been doing some R&D work and working with kind of emerging artists and that kind of thing. How tell us a bit more about that work and how it's looked this year.
Yeah, well, this is a great opportunity for me, Connor, really, to talk a little bit about the North Wall, because I think in some ways it's a bit of a hidden gem in Oxfordshire. Is that there are some people who clearly know about it, and we have a great audience, but there's a lot of people when Rhea and I took over the role who genuinely didn't know a great deal about the organisation or the building,
Mm.
or what we do. And so I suppose I split it three ways really. Is that one is the public program. So we invite performers into our building, whether that's theatre or music or comedy, and we have a public program of work that people can buy tickets for in that conventional way. And alongside Deal Fire Station and Oxford Playhouse, we provide entertainment or productions for people to come and watch. But we also do a really important strand of work, which we call Arts Lab, but it is very much about artist development. So I
Hmm.
don't know if you know where the North Wall sits, but we sit
Yes.
right on the vicinity of a very kind of well-established school, St Edward's. St
Hmm.
Edward's is a boarding school, and that when out of term time, they're really generous with their resources in that they give us their boarding houses, so we can invite artists in from all over the country and the world to spend some time with us and have these what we call residential experiences at Easter and in the summer. And
Mm.
that's a brilliant, brilliant and quite rare opportunity now to bring people from all over the country and spend some really kind of distilled time together. And we do a number of those kind of projects where we look at kind of new writing. So we work with 6 new writers every year. We look at directing. So we work with 3 directors and give them an opportunity to put their shows on the stage. And we also have developed a company of performers and actors that we kind of draw on and use them as a resource as well to kind of provide training resource for those directors and writers. So
Mm.
it's a really exciting place to be. And as a director and somebody who's really interested, I think a lot of my background has been about working with kind of emerging artists and people at the start of their career. This is a great opportunity to continue that work.
Yeah, that it sounds absolutely extraordinary. I mean, you mentioned there about how exciting it is to work with artists and really nurture and develop that talent. And that is something that you certainly did as artistic director of the National Youth Theatre. You were there for 5 years.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, it's a huge job and it's a huge opportunity and an exciting opportunity for young people. This was obviously during the kind of mid noughties you were there. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, tell us about your time there.
So yeah, so I mean, you're right that as artistic director, I was there for 5 years, but I'd been associate there for 3 or 4 years before that, and then
Oh,
was a member. I joined as a member when I was, kind of a young lad of 14 right back in the mid 80s. So it always
yeah,
played a really important part in my kind of formative years and my development, I suppose. And it was an organization that made a huge difference to the way that I looked at life and looked at opportunities, and really got me into, I suppose, the idea that the creative industry could be something where I could forge a career and work really, really happily. My period as artistic director was an extraordinary period of change and development for the company. It came, um, it was around the time where there was an a great deal of funding available, actually, and a real passion for the arts and that kind of thing. So while we were, myself and the other co-artist director, Paul Roseberry, were in charge, we got the first kind of grant from the Arts Council to the tune of about £250,000. So
wow,
it was a really significant period of expansion where we were able to do a great deal of work working with young people again from all over the country and providing them with that opportunity. So it was terrific to come back and kind of, I suppose, kind of help direct the company, help steer the company through that period, having been so attached to it as a young member when I was 14 years old and turned up in London
yeah.
very green behind the ears.
That's it's an amazing thing to come back to it and be able to give back in the way that you did. I mean, it's such a tricky time. I mean, you take COVID out of the equation again, and it's been a difficult period for young people to really cement their place in the arts or to forge a career. Um, Earlier in the series, I spoke to
Mhm.
Paul Boyd about this kind of thing, and Paul left university in the 90s and immediately formed a theatre company, and it went on, and it really helped Paul to be able to establish himself in theatre in that way. And Paul said he wasn't sure if he'd left university nowadays that he would be able to have those same opportunities and to be able to focus on theatre purely in the way that he did. Do you think that the National Youth Theatre and other schemes like it, and indeed the work that you do at the North Wall as well, has a kind of more important role than ever in giving opportunities to young people and preparing them for the, difficult reality of what it is to actually want to work in the arts now?
Yeah, absolutely, Connor. I think you've hit something really, really important, which is that the arts is tricky at the best of times. It's difficult to get established, and particularly difficult if you come from a place or a community where it's not part of the habit, almost, that you might not
Mm,
be used to it. So somebody like me, I grew up in a little village up in kind of rural North Yorkshire. Nobody in my family had been involved with the theatre at all. I'd never, kind of met anybody who was involved in it, never kind of understood that that was a possibility. But then, I knew I had a passion to do and be involved in the theatre. I kind of did the local school play and the local village pantomime and that kind of thing. But it was when I actually went to the National Youth Theatre that I suddenly realised there was lots of other people from all different backgrounds, all different walks of life that were equally as passionate as me, and that what the National Youth Theatre gave me was that space and time to really explore that and do it without a great deal of consequence. And what I feel as though is happening now is that often people are just barred from that opportunity, so that they leave university or drama school and they don't get the opportunity because they haven't got the kind of natural resource behind them to survive. They can't pay the rent, they have to earn
yeah.
some living somewhere, and so just don't get those opportunities, or that they're expected to succeed incredibly quickly, so that you're almost as if every single thing you do has so much jeopardy involved in it, and that if it's
Mm,
not an instant success, then there is no comeback. And I do think, when I think back to the start of my career, we were allowed to kind of experiment. We were allowed to play quite a bit. We were allowed to do things, that some of them failed, some of them succeeded, but all of it was a fantastic learning opportunity. And I do worry that that has gone, and particularly gone for, whether it's a class thing or a diversity thing, I don't know, but it just feels as though certain people have an opportunity and others don't necessarily have that. And certainly when Ria
Yeah.
and I are putting together the program for the North Wall in terms of the arts lab work that we do, it is very much about providing an opportunity that's free at the points of access. So we don't charge people for the work. We work really hard to try and raise the funding to provide those opportunities for people so they don't need to worry. And it's not just about the opportunity to do the work, but also we provide them with a place to stay, we provide them with food, we provide them, put them into an environment where everybody is kind of equal. Everybody gets that chance to really kind of delve into the work, and there aren't those concerns that everyday concerns that worry everybody, I think, at the start of their career.
Hmm.
Now, I make that sound very grand, I suppose, but we can only do that for a very small amount of time. So those experiences are for maybe 10 or 14 days or something like that.
Hmm.
But it's surprising how beneficial that is at building networks, at getting people to understand and get to know other people. And, as we all know, as you go through life, it's those connections that you make, those contacts that you make, that where you generate then kind of ideas and work. But it's something that really does, it matters to me that everybody gets that opportunity. And I suppose I've always been a kind of a defender of the underdog, if you like. So I'm always looking for those people who would otherwise not have the opportunity. And
Hmm.
although I'm massively keen on finding talent and finding people with, real skill and everything, it also matters to me is that if I can help somebody bridge someone towards a career, then that's really important to me.
It's absolutely incredible. It's so vital, and it's having those opportunities and for it to not be prohibitively expensive is hugely important. It's something I find in comedy a lot, and I know you've got a really
Mhm.
strong interest in comedy as well, and you've worked in comedy. But there is that risk, of course, that to establish yourself in comedy, it involves gigging a lot and traveling around, and it kind of falls on people who have a bit of money behind them. They can afford to put that legwork in to travel around more because it's an expensive thing to travel to 6 gigs a week
Yeah.
when you're trying to keep up another job and that kind of thing. So it's hugely important to make it accessible.
You're right, and it's bizarre, isn't it? Because I think in some ways comedy is one of the more democratic areas. You
Yeah,
compare that to filmmaking, say, or TV making, and it's only those people that can afford to be on set and literally earn nothing in order
yeah.
to get that experience that may lead to at some point a job as a runner or whatever. So I do think there's a lot of work to be done, and when you look at what we have in this country, if you like, is a great history of creative people, but actually a lot of them now are really talking about the opportunities that they had when they were younger that don't seem to be there today. And I think it's not just about our industry. That's maybe about the world as it is at the moment.
Hmm.
But yeah, anything that we can do to help bridge that, I think is really, really important.
Absolutely. The arts lab that you talk about and that whole thing of be not just working with people that you otherwise wouldn't have had the opportunity to meet and to work with, but actually the idea of kind of staying with them and being so immersed in that experience and meeting new people and hearing new perspectives and experiences. It's so exciting, and it's something we were talking very briefly before we started recording. And you, when you were at the National Youth Theatre, you met some of the young people that you were working with there as a teenager, and later on they became colleagues in professional theatre as well. I mean, these things really do have a kind of a tangible and lasting impact.
Yeah, oh, completely. I mean, there's so much in life that leads to other things, and it's only you get to my age, Connor, and suddenly you can start kind of threading it all together and beginning to see it. But certainly at the time, I wasn't really aware that some of those people that I was going to be meeting would become real colleagues, friends for the majority of my life. So my story was that I, at at 14, an English teacher actually recommended you should go and audition for the National Youth Theatre. I didn't know anything about it. My dad sold insurance. My mum was a teacher, but a maths teacher,
Hmm.
and I say, although I'd done like the local village panto, I didn't really have any aspirations for a career in theatre. I went to Newcastle and auditioned for the National Youth Theatre. I was lucky enough to get a place, and I remember at 14, my mum and dad waving me off at York Station. So we come from North Yorkshire. They
Hmm.
waved me off at the station, and I literally got in the train. The second time ever in my life I'd been to London. I'd been once when I was about 7 years old, I think. And they sort of said goodbye to me. I got on the train, got off at King's Cross, and managed to find my way to where the kind of halls of residence were that we were staying in.
Mm.
And I don't think I phoned my mum and dad for, kind of 3 or 4 days probably, because I was so kind of immediately wrapped up. But the first person I met when I went to, it was a place in North London that we were staying, was a guy called Connor Grimes. So your namesake Connor, and
Mm.
he came from Donnock Moor in County Tyrone. And what bonded us, I think, immediately, we both came from a really kind of farming background. So my
Hmm.
family, a lot of them, well, were actually blacksmiths, is what my family did traditionally. Connor's family were all farmers, and these two, and you couldn't have had two more people, more kind of fish out of waters, arrived in London, and immediately, I think, both kind of recognized what the hell are we doing here, and actually we're probably going to need to support one another. And so from that very first evening that we met, when we're all very kind of intimidated by the surroundings, we became very, very close. But Connor is somebody who, over the years, I've kind of come into contact with, and then kind of let him get on with his career. He's let me get on with mine, and then we kind of keep kind of crossing paths occasionally. But yeah, so it's extraordinary how those early experiences can set the path for so many choices in life.
Yeah, it's really quite incredible. And you mentioned earlier when we were chatting before we recorded that that meeting with Connor Grimes led to
Yeah.
you going over and actually working in Northern Ireland, kind of in Belfast or in and around Belfast, uh, in the early '90s, which can't be overstated how interesting a period in Northern Ireland's history that was. So tell us about the time you were there.
Yeah, so it was a couple. So I'd met Connor, I say, in 1984, and then we went out. And actually, we went out, it was right towards the back end of 1991, beginning of 1992, when I was there. And then I kind of left at beginning of 1994, I think. So it was about just over 2 years I was there. Connor had kind of enthused me about this theatre company called Gauntlet that he'd set up. And it was all about laying down the gauntlet, and that Northern Ireland was going to be this place that was going to make great theatre. And I kind of was really excited to be part of it. I'd just finished drama school at the time, so I went across to be in their first production, which we talked about earlier about taking risks. We'd done a version of Prometheus Bound, so it was a Greek tragedy. It was incredibly avant-garde, I suppose. Looking back, the director
Mm.
was a guy called David Warden, who had been a monk. Oh, this is a story that I remember anyway. So had been a monk in Reykjavik for 2 years, but in a silent order. So he hadn't spoken for about 2 years,
Oh my
but all the
God.
while had been kind of imagining this production of Prometheus Bound that he wanted to do. So that's what we turned up to do. I was cast as the chorus, and his idea for the chorus was that I was to be bound. So, like, all my hands and legs were tied together,
Mm.
wrapped in hessian, and blindfolded, and that I was crawling I suppose, like a grub or a slug or something through human hair, right? And Prometheus was in scaffolding, but he was just wearing a very scant sort of jock strap. His voice was being projected from the back of the room. So this was a really out there production.
Yeah.
It being Northern Ireland, O'Connor, is that the first place that we did it was in Lenadoon, which is in West Belfast, in just a community centre. So we
Oh my
arrived, set up
word.
this staging, and people who, a lot of people there won't have seen a great deal of theatre anyway, and certainly won't have seen anything quite like this. So we rock up to do Prometheus Bound in Lenadoon Community Centre. There's people sort of riding in on their bikes. There's all sorts of things going on. But there was something about the production that really worked. So I don't know whether it was David's kind of passion for it. The guy who'd originally played Prometheus, I think, had got injured. So David had ended up playing Prometheus because he didn't have to learn any lines because they were all being kind of projected from the back of a microphone.
Yeah.
And so anyway, we did this thing, and it sort of worked, and it was sort of insane and crazy. But this was typical of Northern Ireland at the time anyway, was somebody for some reason from the Irish Times had come in and watched it and immediately projected onto it this whole kind of political kind of narrative, which was Prometheus was clearly Sinn Féin Jerry Adams, who'd been robbed of his voice, that the voice was being projected by different actors at the back of the room. The chorus was this blind fool walking around in human detritus, and just put on top of it this thing that, and I have to be honest, we never even spoken about in rehearsal, but it was why it was such a brilliant place to make theatre at the time, because whatever you did clearly had such significance and meaning, and people were having to process so much anyway at that time, that it was it was just a terrific place to do work.
That's extraordinary. And obviously, having grown up there is absolutely nothing we can't turn in to a green and orange issue there. It's, us'ns and them'ns, everything falls under that barrier. That's really quite incredible.
Yeah. Well, and clearly, because I came as, somebody who'd kind of knew a tiny bit about Ireland, but again, didn't really know. But at the time, from the outside looking in, Belfast was this, no-go zone, really, in the early 90s. And, I was saying earlier that I've been back since that time, and it's a very, very different city to what it was then. But you
incredible.
were literally crossing 2 or 3 peace lines in order to get to work. So we lived in Stranmillis, which is around sort of Queen's University area, and that actually was a very it was functioning as a university sort of community, but we were working in Ardoyne, which is right over the other side of Belfast, which is, and in order to get there, we'd be pretty much every day be stopped and asked where we were going, and then you'd move a little bit further and then you'd be stopped again. So it was an extraordinary place to work. But my overwhelming memory of the place is one of absolute joy. I just loved being there, being surrounded by these people, and feeling really kind of alive and excited to be part of something. And, we were talking again about opportunities, but the fact was that people were so desperate for any positive news coming out of Belfast that as a theatre company, we were really well supported, and we were given that opportunity to try things. So something as ludicrous as doing Prometheus Bound in Lenadoon Community Centre was kind of allowed, and probably had some really positive, impact from it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was full of extraordinary tales. I mean, that's the other thing I learned about Northern Ireland, is that everything can be turned into a story.
Oh, yes.
And so it was great, but overwhelmingly, a wonderful experience. In fact, the only time I think I ever felt even a little bit threatened was we were working in Ardoyne, and we were rehearsing at the time. I think we were doing a production of Amadeus, and I'd been sent out to get coffee.
Yeah.
And I went into Ardoyne and to buy a jar of coffee, but there was, at the time, these incendiary devices called coffee jar bombs that people used to carry. I was innocently walking back with a jar of coffee, but a new load of Brits, English soldiers had come in. This armoured vehicle screeched to a halt. About 6 lads got out, guns pointing at me.
Oh my God.
And it was this really, in hindsight, comical scene, but I'm there with a jar of coffee thinking, I don't know what this is all about. There's a guy shouting at me, going, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?" And I could sort of recognize his accent. And I went, "What do you mean? What do you mean?" And he said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Whitby." "Where are you from?" "I'm from Malton." And it turned out he was a squaddy from North Yorkshire. And it was this crazy moment, Connor, where we were kind of both in this really heightened state, literally with, kind of guns pointed at me. But out of the 2 and a bit years that I was there, that was the only time I ever felt in any way threatened.
It's an absolutely incredible scene. I mean, it's a story, John, that sounds like it should be uh, a sketch or a scene in a sitcom or something, which is
Yeah.
obviously something you've done. You've written comedy. Has that experience ever made it into anything that you've written?
Well, not quite. I mean, yeah. I mean, the I love comedy, and I suppose the way that I, kind of a lot of the work that I've done over the years has always had a kind of comic tone to it, or always search for the funny in something. Because I do think it is a brilliant and perhaps actually the most effective way of engaging an audience and getting an audience to really think about serious things. So I'm a big, a big fan of and believer in comedy. The individual experiences, I think they all kind of blend into some form or another, never quite directly. I must admit that there is very definitely a comedy series to be written about that period in Belfast, and I think maybe having a couple of characters that come from outside of that, kind of community, and a bit like, I was there, of not really understanding any of the politics of it, but just
Yeah,
being part of it. It would be a lovely sort of character to go in. But yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
I say that time was filled with extraordinary ideas, and what it led to was, I mean, Connor and I, you mentioned the kind of crossing paths again. I went back probably 8-9 years later to direct him and his comedy partner Alan McKee in a production that they were doing over Christmas at the Lyric in Belfast. And things have changed dramatically. So Belfast now is this incredibly zhuzhy town with
Oh
coffee
yeah,
bars and
it's a really Neapolitan European city now. Yeah.
yeah, and it's terrific in that way. And and then that was to work on a comedy show that they'd written. And certainly, when I look back on a lot of the things that I've done or had success in, they've always had that kind of comedic edge to them. So whether it's writing or supporting stand-ups or whatever. So
Yeah, you've written a sitcom as well, the Ginge, the Geordie, and the Geek.
well, it's more of a sketch show
A sketch
actually.
show,
So
okay.
yeah. So what the Ginger Geordie and Geek was. So when I was, as you say, artistic director of the National Youth Theatre. One of the great things that happen when you're artistic director of the National Youth Theatre is you meet all these extraordinarily talented individuals, and you
Yeah.
meet them at an age when they aren't necessarily either aware of their talent, but certainly haven't yet got any kind of leverage in the industry. And then kind of over time you build a relationship with some of those people in terms of that you're working with them as a director or as a mentor or whatever, and then hopefully helping them pursue a career. And some of them, not everybody, but some of those people that went to National Youth Theatre go on and become very, very successful.
Hmm.
And the Geordie out of the Ginger and the Geordie and the Geek was somebody I met at National Youth Theatre. So as a member, when I was a director there, and then he asked me to come and see some work that him and two lads that he'd met up in Glasgow. So they went to the uh, school up there, the Queen. I can't remember what
Oh,
the drama school
Queen
is called. At the
Margaret.
Queen Margaret's, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that they'd all met there. And again, as I was saying earlier about the sort of the more democratic edge of comedy. I think as
Hmm.
actors, they'd struggled to break into the industry, but they knew they were really talented and really skilled. And what they managed to put together was this sketch show that they'd done initially in front of a bunch of mates. And they
Mm.
invited me to see it, and I thought it was brilliant. They were brilliant performers and brilliant writers, and what it needed was an outside eye, really. So I became their outside eye, and then
Mm.
we had this phenomenal run both at Edinburgh, but from the success of our Edinburgh show, we were commissioned to do a series for the BBC, well, a pilot initially, and then a series for the BBC. So over a period of about 6 years, going from what was initially just an ambition of four, lads who thought they had something to say and something to be funny about, turning that into something that ends up getting broadcast on the BBC was a really brilliant
Yeah.
journey.
That's really remarkable. I mean, your history of working with comic talent, it's you've obviously worked with so many kind of emerging artists, and you at really interesting points in their career, you've worked with people like Tom Allen and Matthew
Hmm.
Horn. What is it about working with comedians and in comedy that you find so exciting?
Well, I mean, I suppose there's something about stand up, which I think is quite an unusual thing because normally, or certainly for a long period of time, stand ups didn't really have that kind of director. And there's a real balance to be found as well, I think, in terms of as a director, sometimes we feel like, oh, these are our productions, and what we can do is
Hmm.
kind of put a concept on top of a production or an idea or a story. With stand up, there's no point in even attempting to do that because what you're looking to do is really kind of allow the potential of a voice to be heard. And what often happens, so you talk about Matthew and Tom, is I think in both those occasions is that they already had a brilliant kind of voice and that they had brilliant ideas and things. But they what they needed was somebody just both to kind of encourage that and also to be quite upfront and honest with them about what was working and what wasn't working and the
Hmm.
impact that things were having on me as an audience. So I became a little bit like a kind of tryout audience for a period of time.
Mm.
With Tom and with Matt to a degree, I then took on some of the writing and certainly for Tom for the early part of his career, we wrote together quite a lot. So we wrote for the radio and things like that. But what was really clear with somebody like Tom Allen is that he's, a unique individual. He
Mm.
is full of idiosyncrasies and, a wonderfully kind of warm performer. And regardless of my input, I think would have ended up finding his way into the public consciousness anyway. But it's tremendous to watch somebody like that and develop their confidence and ease with an audience. And certainly initially, I think Tom would agree that it's quite scary when you're putting yourself out in front of an audience and you're trying things out. So it's quite useful to have somebody who's going to be an honest sounding board for that.
Yeah. Definitely, it's an aspect my wife really doesn't like about me being a stand-up
Right.
is when I ask her to be the trial audience because she, by her own admission, is quite a harsh audience. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
it's
it's a tricky one though because I do feel as though because what you don't want is somebody just to kind of laugh like a drain at everything that you do, and
yeah,
so it has to be quite technical. I think that outside eye, but neither do you want to apply so much technique that you lose the natural kind of comfort and ease that all good stand-ups need to have. So, I mean, I've really enjoyed that element of what I've done over the years. And it's been quite nice when I suppose when people have come to me for a little bit of thought or advice
mm,
on what might work or may not.
yeah. I mean, is it something that you've ever considered yourself, John? Sort of writing and performing stand-up?
Well, no. I mean, a bizarre thing happened to me, Connor. I suppose that. So, as I said, I came from this very non-theatrical background,
Yeah,
and I was so I think naive and immature when I joined the industry, and certainly kind of from National Youth Theatre, but then also at drama school, and then in the early years of my career, I was just kind of finding things out the whole time. I didn't feel like I had a great deal to give. I was just one of those people that really kind of absorbed everything that was going on around me. But what I do remember at drama school is I gained a reputation for being quite funny. So in improvisation classes and often, when I was cast in something that wasn't even meant to be that funny, I could get laughs from the audience. Now, it bothered me quite a lot because actually when you're, kind of 19, 20, and you think you're playing a really serious role, what you
yeah,
don't want is the audience to kind of find the funny in it.
yes,
And I remember once getting cast as it was a Howard Barker play. It was a character called Natchbull, and he was a kind of senior, sort of late 40s, early 50s civil servant, MI6 character, uber intelligent, but came from the establishment. Clearly been to private school, had kind of gone through the Oxbridge thing, been tapped on the shoulder, and again. now I think I probably do have some, not necessarily experience of that, but I feel as though, okay, I kind of know those people. At the time, I knew nobody like that.
Yeah.
So I do this version of this 50-year-old bloke as a 20-year-old actor, and people just find it funny. And bits of it, kind of work because it was funny. But I remember being really devastated that I couldn't kind of deliver the thing that I wanted to. And as a result, I think I became a little bit almost like, the one thing I'm not going to do is pursue comedy. And
Mm.
you know, I don't know, it's maybe one of the things that I not necessarily regret, but as I look back, is I might have been better placed actually as I left drama school, trying to, kind of try it out as a stand up. But at the time, I just felt like, no, I've got to make serious art. I've got to do Prometheus Bound
Of course.
on the floor with my eyes closed. So, I'm definitely of the mindset which says we've all got so much to learn, and that, life is a journey or whatever, and I'm work in progress. So I
Mm.
tell myself every day that, there's things to learn and there's things to do. So yeah, I'd never say never.
That's very exciting. Well, perhaps I'm going to poke and prod at you a little bit more in 2021 and see if we can
Right.
encourage you on stage.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of 2021, have you got any, obviously this year,
Hmm.
well, I was going to say actually has been a bit of a write off, but as you've already explained, it's not been a write off. You've managed to remain creative and still do exciting work at the North Wall,
Yeah.
but things are beginning to look a little bit more hopeful. Perhaps we'll be able to get audiences back in on a more regular basis, fuller houses. Is there anything particularly that's exciting you about 2021? Anything that's kind of piquing your
Yeah.
creative interest at the moment?
Well, yes, absolutely. And I think, again, it's been an interesting time. So even given the times that we've been through, what we've managed to do at the North Wall is have a couple of performances. So we've done some Jericho work, we've done
Yeah.
a couple of things where we've had audiences in. Now it's obviously a much reduced capacity than you'd usually have, and we're
Hmm.
working really hard to follow any COVID guidelines.
Hmm.
But we are managing to do that, and fingers crossed, if we get our opportunity over December, we've got a number of shows that are coming in that again, are reduced capacity, but I think it's important that we offer shows for people, and there definitely is an appetite for people to come and see things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Going forward, I mean, talk about the arts lab. I've been working for the last couple of years with a brilliant performer called Lewis Doherty, and Lewis was somebody who used to go to Oxford Drama School and then became part of our arts lab ensemble, if you like, and
Hmm.
then 2 or 3 years ago, he came to me with a show that he'd started creating called Wolf, which is a one-man kind of. Well, that one was a kind of pastiche of film noir. So it's him playing about 40 different characters, kind of really rapid fire, extraordinary performance. So, I
Mm.
mean, I always cite Lewis as being one of the most physically gifted actors I've ever worked with. But
Wow.
we've been working on a trilogy of that. So Wolf was the first show. We completed Boar. And one of the things that we did in lockdown was start work on the third of those, which is Hawk. And so we're hoping to bring Hawk to the public in 2021. And it's just a wonderful showcase for Lewis, but also just a brilliant show to be to kind of sit in the audience and watch. It's one of those where you're kind of mesmerized.
Wow.
And bizarrely is, I mean, this is what I keep saying to Lewis, is I think what audiences are going to need in 2021 is the confidence and reassurance to come back into an auditorium. And so actually we need to give work that, kind of really celebrates the act of theatre, and that the idea of seeing brilliant performance, and that we can't make audiences work too hard in
Yeah.
that sense. It needs to be stuff that's really inclusive, I think. Also, as a one-man show, it is pretty COVID secure in terms
Yes, of
of
course.
that we can do something where it can just be him on stage, the audience can be relatively distant. But what Lewis manages to kind of make manifest is this massive epic scale. So the kind of subjects. So the first one, Wolf, was film noir. The second one was kind of a Marvel adventure hero. The third one is a sci-fi. He takes you into these kind of really immense, epic worlds, and so you don't feel shortchanged. So it's not like watching a monologue or a stand-up. You feel like you've been to the cinema and seen this extraordinary kind of scope of film that he manages
Wow.
to do. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. That's something that we're planning to bring in 2021, hopefully take to Edinburgh. We're also working with a young Oxfordshire writer called Karim Khan. He's writing a new play for us, which again I'm hoping to take up to Edinburgh next year. And Karim
Amazing.
is a brilliant writer that we met as part of the Arts Lab work that we do. And he's writing a, a, a play about a guy who can't swim. Actually, it's about two
Oh,
two friends who and from the kind of South Asian community, and they get invited to a pool party by one of their kind of classmates, and one of them works out he can't swim, and it kind of throws up all kinds of questions about the community and about kind of all sorts of things. So Corinne's currently writing that, so I can't tell you too much because I've not even read the first draft yet. But we've had
yeah.
we're starting to work on that together.
How exciting that you've got these things to look forward to. And 2021 sounds like it's going to be a real celebration of theatre and of performance and of audiences getting together and experiencing things. It's hugely exciting.
Yeah, and I think, and again, is that the other thing that we've tried to do at the North Wall is I think it's expanded. So some of the work that we're doing outside, it's expanded. We've set up now what we're calling youth lab, but it's much more for local youngsters to get involved. I think one of the really kind of upsetting things for young people through this COVID period is that they've been robbed of a lot of that extracurricular activity. I
Yeah,
mean, they've been robbed of the curricular activity anyway, but hopefully we're over the next couple of years we're going to be able to provide lots of opportunities for people who have an interest in the arts and in theatre and that kind of thing to get involved and to make work and meet people and do all the things that we've been talking about.
amazing. It sounds like the North Wall is definitely something to keep an eye on in 2021.
Hmm.
I'm so excited. I mean, John, there's so much. I could literally sit here and talk to you for hours, all about the work you do there and about your previous work and all about comedy and theatre. But you've kindly given up your time to tell me about your dream dinner party. So I feel I should get to that now.
Okay.
Um, I am so excited about the group of guests you've put together. They're an incredibly interesting group of people. Without going into the specifics yet,
Hmm.
tell me what a John Hoggarth dinner party looks like. Is it kind of a lively affair? Is it just fascinating conversation and lots of wine? What do you envisage a dinner party of yours looking like?
Gosh, well, I think wine might be important. I think there's something about um, I mean, I love dinner parties. We don't give too many, and certainly I feel like we've missed them. But I love both going to dinner parties and being part of them. And I think it comes from my mum really, is I take a real pride in kind of making people, playing the host and making people feel welcome and making sure that there is, you know, too much food and too much wine and people don't need to worry about those sort of things. So hopefully it would be a fairly, I don't know what's the word, Rabanalian or whatever, but that sense of a kind of lots and lots to look at and taste and eat and enjoyable. And
Excellent.
yeah, I don't know, comforting and enjoyable. The dinner parties that I don't enjoy is when I feel like I've got to be on my best behavior. So I'd quite like to
Oh,
encourage a bit of
yes.
a relaxation and a sense of kicking the shoes off and feeling
Yeah.
comfortable.
I think that sounds like an excellent quality in a dinner party. I would hate to go to dinner anywhere where I was expected to behave well. That would be what a boring night.
Yes.
And yours is guaranteed not to be that. So we know the kind of the tone. What we
Hmm.
need to know now is if you could do it anywhere in the world, if you could host this fantastic group of people anywhere, where would you be
Okay.
doing this?
Well, I've mentioned a couple of times I come from this little village in North Yorkshire, and I kind of having thought about your question, and I could have had it. I once had a fantastic holiday in Japan and a
Oh, wow.
fantastic meal in Japan, and or it could be X, Y, and Z. But I've actually kind of concluded that the best place for me to hold a dinner party would be back at home, and I say my family have lived in literally in the same village for generations. So um, we live in a little place called Glaisdale, which is up the Esk Valley. It's just inland from Whitby, but
Mm,
we've been in that village for literally hundreds of years, and
wow.
that as a family we were always the village blacksmiths. So I think there was probably no reason to leave the village, and there was always a kind of a job for us, but we never got too grand to kind of, I don't know, kind of move above our station, if you like. So
Sure.
so it kind of kept us rooted and familiar in that place. But the first place that I lived was a place called Esk View, which is in the village centre, but it was above the blacksmith's forge. So where the forge used to be for the blacksmiths. Now, in my time, the sort of the blacksmith kind of disappeared, if you like. So the forge stopped functioning, and actually my granddad and his two brothers became hauliers, is what they did as work. They used to collect bulk
Yeah.
milk around the territory. But what I'm imagining for my place is actually it doesn't quite exist, this place, so you've got to slightly imagine it, but it's the old forge of the blacksmith, and that there in the corner is this kind of hot furnace that's potentially going to working. And I thought that'd be a great place to both kind of warm us and our toes and also cook on as well. So that's
Oh,
that's
wow.
what I'm imagining. So is a table to the side, the six of us sat around that table, but in the corner is the forge, and that might be the providers with the heat and the fire glow for
Extraordinary.
the stories.
Oh, my word. That sounds like quite something. Yeah, a suitably, I don't know, quite a theatrical sounding kind of
Yeah,
culinary event. I think that's
it
quite
does.
appropriate.
Yeah. Well, I think I've heard a couple of people say, but I think one of the things about a great dinner party is often the isolation that you need. It's almost like you need to be taken out of your everyday
Yes.
and into something, so that it is like it is a journey, or a thing that you're going to, and that there is no escape, if you like. Now, for some people, that's terrifying. But if you get the right environment, I think it can be a wonderful way to spend, a number of hours with people and
Absolutely.
learn about one another.
I couldn't agree more. That sounds absolutely perfect. Well, it's time now to find out about a few of your guests. The first guest is an Irish satirist and comedian. He rose to prominence in Australia before gaining notoriety in the UK, where for 14 years the BBC aired his show. He was someone who didn't shy away from controversial topics, which would make him a fascinating dinner party guest. You're inviting Dave Allen.
Yeah.
Tell
Yeah. Well,
me, when did you first become a fan of Dave Allen's?
I think probably in the 70s. So I was a child of the 70s, if you like. So that's when I grew up.
Hmm.
And I remember, I think it was called Dave Allen at Large. I think it was called. It
Hmm.
was a television show.
Yes.
And I remember I mean, I should say, talk about Ireland, but my mum was brought up Catholic. We were brought up Catholic. My dad was kind of brought up, well, I don't know what he considered himself, agnostic or atheist or whatever. But anyway,
Hmm.
religion played a part in our lives. My grandma used to have a kind of classic picture of the Sacred Heart above her fireplace, and you had to kind of dip your hand in holy water as you walk through the door and all those
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
things. So even at that time, when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, we were watching Dave Allen. So I don't know if that would be allowed nowadays anyway. But I just remember him being quite transgressive, really, in terms of there was a real risk in what he was doing. But what I also remember is my mum, who was the kind of serious Catholic, if you like, finding him hilarious and finding the whole thing very funny. And then as a kid, I just remember how compelling he was as a storyteller. So again,
Hmm.
my very early memory was that when he used to kind of go into his kind of anecdote and his story, his he could hold the audience so easily and
Hmm.
so wonderfully, that I was, even as a 6, 7 year old, I was absolutely compelled to listen. And he was really wonderful. And then again, in hindsight, what you begin to recognize and realize is just how skilled one he was at that, how he was constantly kind of pushing the boundaries in terms of, kind of having a poke at establishment and
Mm.
religion and
Hmm.
those things. He's kind of inbuilt, I think, both hatred and fear that, from what I've read and learnt about him since, is that he had a pretty devastating time in a Jesuit monastery being taught by nuns and priests, and really having an anger towards those people who he felt put the fear of God literally
Mm.
into him.
Hmm.
And a lot of that was being kind of spoken through comedy. So again, back to this idea of comedy is a brilliant tool to talk about really serious things, really meaningful things, but do it in a way that allows people in and allows people, I think, to explore it.
Yeah, and he was absolutely one of the best at doing that. About And particularly, I guess, at the time he was doing it, it was, as you said, a bit controversial. The sometimes the subjects he was drawn to. He was also
Yeah.
something of a kind of a social commentator. In the early '60s and '70s, he was making documentaries about
Yeah, yeah.
things like
I mean,
racism and drugs. Like a fascinating
yeah.
man.
Well, I think he trained, didn't he, as a journalist? That was his. So again, I've kind of learnt all this in hindsight. So, but I think he trained as a journalist, came across
Hmm.
to the UK fully expecting that he would, immediately get his place on the kind of Times editorial or whatever,
Hmm.
and actually didn't do particularly well. Nobody wanted to know him. He was sent out into the regions and things. And then I think his brother was working as a redcoat up in Filey, up
Yeah.
in my neck of the
Yeah.
woods, up in North Yorkshire. And he went and became a redcoat because he needed the money. So although Dave Allen had come from, I think, quite a well-to-do family, his dad died quite early on, and I think
Hmm.
left them pretty penniless actually for a
Mm.
period. And so he wasn't somebody, I think he'd kind of arrived into the world with lots and lots of extraordinary meetings with extraordinary people, and then all that kind of was robbed from him when his dad died. And then he came over to the UK and struggled, but then found a kind of a route forward as a Butlins redcoat. And it was there that I think he developed his craft for stand up and things.
Yeah.
But as you say, he continued then when he did get a little bit more kind of notoriety and a bit of a public persona. He saw himself still very much as a journalist. And a lot of the work that he did was around eccentricity, about exploring, the kind of unusual people. And I think they're still available on YouTube actually, but I certainly watched one a couple of years ago. And what fascinates me about him is his curiosity. So
Mm.
he never judges people. So although he's got a very kind of strong opinion and he lets you know what his opinion is, he's totally non-judgmental. And so he doesn't attack at any stage. And it feels very much like that curiosity and that kind of um, encouragement of other people's views and trying to understand other people's views is, one of the qualities that I most admire in him.
That's really interesting. And that thing about qualities is something that I want to kind of delve a bit more into. That curiosity, I think, is one of the most extraordinary qualities a person can have, but certainly a creative person can have. In terms of the comedy, the jokes that he wrote,
Mhm.
we've mentioned perhaps a little controversial for the time. Certainly, he was a kind of equal opportunities, uh, not offender, because I don't
Mhm.
think it was necessarily offence that he sought to cause, but he punched up, he punched down, he punched left, he punched right. Everybody was a potential
Yeah.
topic of a joke of his. What other qualities, or what qualities indeed, in his work
Well, I
attracted you at the beginning?
yeah. So I mean, again, I think as a youngster, I was attracted to the daftness of a lot of what he did. So a lot of the sketches, a lot of the cutaways from him sat down with his glass of whiskey and cigarette were kind of very daft sketches. Whether it's the Pope doing a striptease or whatever, they were kind of above all else a bit daft, really.
Yeah.
But obviously, again, quite transgressive at the time. But I heard him speaking in an interview. I don't know which interview it was that he gave, but he was saying that he had lots of friends who worked as cleric, as priests or whatever. And
Hmm.
he said he never got a complaint from anybody, in that position. It was always other people who were offended on their behalf. And I
Mm.
do think it points to something, again, probably don't need to get into, but there's a lot of debate at the moment about what should we say, what shouldn't we say, what we need to be careful. And I think comedy, is an area where traditionally has been a place where you can have sort of jibes at people, you can puncture, as you say, you can punch up left, right, downwards, whichever way you want. And I think Dave Allen's a brilliant example of somebody who understood his responsibility. So I think it mattered to him. I don't think he was there to offend people, but he was there to put some kind of spotlight. I mean, he always used to end
Mm.
his TV shows with "May your God go with you," and I always again
Hmm.
was struck by how respectful that was. So despite the fact that he'd spent the previous 28 minutes or whatever
Hmm.
kind of lampooning a lot of organized religion and those sort of things, I don't think he had any hatred towards the individuals. I think it was the kind of the body of religion, if you like, the establishment of it that he had truck with. um,
Yeah.
and I do think he was um, kind of responsible with it. And again, even when we were working on the Ginger Georgie the Geek, which was a show, which was a sketch show, but inevitably with all comedians, you spend an awfully long time thinking about, right, who's the target of this joke? Where is this going to land? How is
Hmm.
this going to be? What's it going to do? And I suppose, kind of, I'm acutely aware of the power that a joke can have. And I think, it's really important that we take responsibility for where the target of a joke is and make sure that we are doing something. But it does concern me that, I don't want to kind of put a puritanical vein or a veil over comedy as well. I'd prefer to let people kind of try stuff and see, rather than, I don't, I hate the idea of banning things or censoring things
Sure.
or stopping things in some way.
Yeah. That's really, you're absolutely right. That's so interesting. I mean, where do you think he would sit in kind of today's comedy world where like it's so difficult to shock nowadays,
Mm.
and I think that's why we see so many kind of extreme opinions sometimes expressed on stage. People try to find a shortcut around sometimes
Yeah, yeah.
being funny and go straight to trying to shock. But
Yeah.
Dave Allen certainly couldn't be accused of that. He may have been sometimes shocking, but he was always funny. But
Hmm.
where do you think he would sit in today's kind of comedy landscape?
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things, I never met him to talk to, but I was in his vicinity two or three times. His son Ed was an actor for a while,
Hmm.
and Ed was in a show in Scarborough that I saw, and Dave Allen was there in the audience. And I remember kind of being really taken by him because he was such a striking, good-looking guy. But I also met him at Edinburgh, and he used to, right towards the very end of his career, used to go to Edinburgh and sit in the audiences and kind of watch comedy. And he had a real interest in comedy,
Hmm.
and would, without imposing himself on people, but if he found something interesting, he'd go and find the performer and have a chat with them and things. And so I think, right up until the very end of his career, he was somebody who was curious about and completely changing his style. So, his last TV performance, he was stood up, he wasn't sat down, he'd lost a cigarette. He was, I mean, one of the last TV things he did, he was, I don't know if he was banned for, but he used the F word at a time when it was still very shocking to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I've heard him speak really articulately about why it was important to use that particular plosive at that particular time in order to land the joke in the way that it needed to be landed. And again, I've
Mm.
got great respect for somebody who, if they are going to do something that ends up being provocative, have a reason behind it and that are willing to express that. And it isn't just about, as you say, shocking an audience or doing something for impact, if you like. It's
Yeah.
something that's thought through, and I think he was incredibly thoughtful in that way.
Absolutely. He'd be a
Yeah,
fascinating person to speak to about all of that thought process and
yeah, yeah,
about
yeah,
the I guess some of the controversies in his career and his rationale and
yeah.
what he thought of the time that he was trying to speak in. But I mean, what would you want to hear from him? What do you think he'd be like as a guest and what do you think you would want to talk to him
Well,
about?
I mean, selfishly, there's a bit of me that just wants to sit around a fire, forge or whatever, and listen to him tell a story. So, I mean, I do
Yeah.
think as a raconteur or as a storyteller, I think he was extraordinary. I mean, one of the world's best. I directed a show a couple of about a year and a half ago with a brilliant actor called Monica Dolan. So Monica is somebody again that I'd worked with a number of years ago as an actor when I used to act in things. And then she
Mm.
came to me and said, "I've written this thing. Would you mind doing it?" And it was a one woman show called The Beasts, and I directed it and we worked together and I helped her kind of shape the script and things. But one of the people that she kind of pointed to was Dave Allen. She said, "I want it to have this feel of kind of me just talking to an audience, no effort, no a real sense of connection with the
Hmm.
audience." So we cited him, and I suppose that's what I would kind of want to be in the presence of. Is I do think he's one of those people that when the spotlight was on him, when you gave him the space and time, would hold that space and time beautifully, but without kind of dominating everybody else. I think he'd have real curiosity. I think he'd be really curious about the other people sat around the table. But when you wanted him to tell a story, I think he'd do it to perfection.
I bet he would. You're absolutely right. It would just be amazing to sit in a little intimate environment with a fire on and listen to a great storyteller like him. A
Yeah.
terrific, terrific first guest. And your next guest, it's fair to say, is pretty different. She
Yeah.
is an Icelandic singer, songwriter, actress, and DJ. She's famous for her eclectic style of music, her unique voice, and her eccentric fashion. She's also a gifted actor, winning the Best Actress award at the 2000 Cannes Film Festival. You're inviting Bjork to your dinner party.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
She's a fascinating choice. Why have you chosen Bjork?
Well, yeah. I mean, again, I've never met Bjork. I don't know her, in any way other than being a kind of a fan of her work.
Hmm.
But more than a fan of her music, every time I hear her speak, I feel like I'm in the presence of somebody with more insight into the world than just about anybody. So she's one of those really rare. I don't want this to sound in any way patronizing, but like a spirit, like she's been
Hmm.
kind of dropped amongst us and actually has this otherness about her, a kind of um, I don't know, a sense of knowing that we'd all do well to just kind of listen to. And I think, she's a quiet voice. It seems to me she's somebody who, isn't overly imposing in lots of ways. You mentioned her eccentricity in terms of her clothing and things like that, but she's someone who's always had a really clear understanding of who she is, what she wants her music to be, what she sees herself as being. This real acute awareness, self-awareness about her. And and I urge you to anybody to go and listen to a couple of interviews that she's given, because I do feel like she's come from the future or something. She's there to kind of give us some guidance. And yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I find her kind of funny and I find her
Hmm.
mischievous. As you say, I think she's a wonderful actor, as was Dave Allen, by the way. Dave Allen was a brilliant, brilliant performer. And there's the sort of actors that I really love to work with, that you kind of bring these unusual performances, but I don't know, yeah, that it's just a wonderful quality, a life, a spirit that she carries with her that I'd love to, yeah, be amongst.
That's a really really fascinating reason. I mean, I sort of try, when I first hear people's guest lists, I'm already thinking, why have they invited this person? It
Mhm.
must be that they're a fan of, this part of their work or this quality of their work. And it's sort of that's quite unexpected to me that it seems to be about the way that she speaks and her outlook and her kind of manner, rather than necessarily it just being a simple case of you're a really big fan of her music. But is there that side of it as well? Would you
Yeah,
consider yourself a fan
absolutely.
of
So
hers?
I love her music, and I'm sometimes really challenged by it as well. So I mean, I first came across Björk as when she was part of the Sugar Cubes, and
Hmm.
that again, it's way, way, way back, and I was still, kind of relatively young, and I say, I mean, I painted my picture as this kind of slightly kind of naive, innocent walking through life, but someone like the Sugar Cubes, I used to listen to John Peel, as I think a lot of people did in those days, and um, and it just struck me as being different. This Icelandic group that did this kind of extraordinary music that sometimes was quite melodic and other times was completely kind of jarring and difficult. And then Björk came from that. And her first album debut was actually a a a kind of much more tranquil, much more melodic kind of version than I'd been used to with the Sugar Cubes.
Hmm.
And I heard it again. I heard her talk about it, and she said the reason why it was that way is she had a. I think this is right. Again, I'm no expert on this, but I think she just had a child when she was making debut,
Hmm.
and so and she made the music while the child was asleep upstairs. So she had to be incredibly quiet and incredibly kind of reflective while she was making this music. So so which is why it might be different from some of her later albums or whatever. But I'm always challenged by her music. So sometimes I'll listen to it and I don't get it. I don't understand what
Mm.
I'm meant to do or how to access that. But my God, I love the fact that she's making it and being allowed to have her own choices. So you know, as any artist, I think to get creative freedom is an extraordinary thing. But as a young woman in the pop industry, I just think
Hmm.
that's phenomenal that she's had that strength, that will to maintain, her defiance and say, no, this is what I'm doing. These are the people that I'm working with. This is what
Hmm.
I think is important. And she's, had a long career doing that. And I haven't heard anybody say anything bad about her either. So she's clearly
Mm, yeah.
getting the right people around her, that people want to work with her. She's not diva-ish or upsetting. She just knows what she wants and produces it in that way. She often talks about actually there's no harm sometimes in being selfish. What's the journey, and do the thing that inspires you. And
Yeah.
if you're in tune with the audience or in step with the audience, you might find yourself on a hit. But that, it clearly, it's not about success. It's not about unit sales for her. It's very much about the journey that she's on as an artist.
That's really incredibly interesting. And I think what you've talked about there might be you might have hit the nail on the head as to the secret to her kind of longevity. I mean, she released her first album when she was only 11 years
Yeah.
old. So, remarkably, for a still relatively young woman, she's been an active artist now for over 40 years. And she has that longevity. She is so experimental and she's curious. There's a certain kind of dreamlike quality to some of her work. I
Hmm.
mean, beyond beyond the kind of obvious to someone like me who maybe isn't as familiar with her work, what kind of other qualities are there to her work that you think make her so exciting?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose it is this notion of, I think she identifies that we are all as human beings quite complicated, quite complex. And so it seems to me that she looks inwards and probably sees, you know, the good and bad in herself and recognizes that we're all a mixture of those things. And a bit, we talked about Dave Allen earlier, but I think he has a similar quality as well, actually, is a recognition that all of us are capable of extraordinary kindness and compassion and things. But we're also, I think, all of us capable of some pretty cruel tricks and some, kind of things that we would be less proud of, or whatever. And she somehow acknowledges that and has awareness of that. And again, I think that's um, well, it's just a wonderful quality when you meet people on at that stage. And
Hmm.
as you say, it feels to me like she's had it from a child. She has this kind of wonderful childlike quality. But I've got two youngsters two daughters, one 6 and one 3.
Hmm.
Björk has a quality of a 3-year-old, and some 3-year-olds can teach us so much about the world
Yeah.
because they just respond to it. Whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, you get this emotional response, and it's true, and it's not adapted. It's not, uh, kind of um, bridled. It's not, I
Hmm.
don't know, whatever the word is, but that's a wonderful quality. And I say, I think there's a real bravery to somebody like that who, Björk's been through the ringer on occasion where people have tried to ridicule her or tried to be cruel to her. Her experience with Lars von Trier's, I think, was a really difficult
Hmm.
experience because he was a bully and he
Hmm.
made her feel dreadful. Now, he got to a wonderful performance, but I heard her talk about it and say, I don't know why that was even necessary because actually I could have got there anyway, but he felt as
Mm.
though he had to do something to her as a director in order to get out this performance. Well, again, I mean, I'm certainly that's not the director I would want to be
No.
with an individual.
No. I mean, the person that you're describing and the way that she makes you feel and the things she makes you think in response to her work and her personality, it sounds relatively profound. I mean, it sounds like you're envisaging being in the presence of someone who's really going to make you think and feel things. What
Yeah,
would you
but
expect if you did have dinner with her? How do you think she would be?
well, I think she would be. I hope anyway. Would be impish and mischievous. All the things that you imagine. Because I think she's also really funny. That's the other thing that really strikes me about her when I've seen her interviewed and things, is she's got a really good turn of phrase, really good wit, really good insight.
Mhm.
It's very left field, but that is some of my favorite comedy anyway, where you can look at a thing and then somebody brings another perspective and suddenly you see it in a wholly different way. And I think she provides that kind of insight. It's those, the Spike Milligans, those sort of people who are
Mhm.
able to look at a thing and give you another version of it, which just shines a light in such a different way. So that's for me what I hope Björk would do. She'd also be, I think, again, all of them have a spirit of creativity. I think all
Mhm.
my guests, I think, I hope, have a hunger to keep growing. And so I think we could have a really good kind of sing song and we'd play the various cutlery and bottles and bits of blacksmith paraphernalia, kind of create some music around the table in a um, yeah, in a nice way.
I like that. I really like the thought of you all finding things in the room and having an impromptu jam together. That's pretty
Yeah.
cool. You mention as a kind of thread that runs through your guests creativity, and that is something that your next guest
Mhm.
talked about with such passion and with such extraordinary humor. He was a fascinating author, public speaker, and advocate for creative education in the arts. His
Mm.
TED Talks have gone viral, and he wrote so many best selling books on creativity, education, and young people. You've got the amazing Sir Ken Robinson coming to your dinner party.
Yeah. So I really, really appreciate what Ken Robertson was talking about and the things that he was a brilliant communicator of some ideas that in somebody else's mouth, if you like, with somebody else's vibe, could sound quite alien and quite
Hmm.
wishy-washy or inappropriate somehow. And I just think he found a brilliant way of speaking and communicating ideas in a way that everybody could understand, and just to my mind anyway, just seem so kind of bleeding obvious in terms of how
Mm.
you get the best potential from people and how we should be educating and working with not just the young actually, but with all people that were, as I said earlier, we're all on this journey, we're all learning as we go. But actually, how do you create the environment? How do you? He talks about people finding their element. He talks about that. His first book
Okay.
was called The Element, and he says that it's really important that we find our element as people. So, what is a thing? What is a place where we feel like we can really kind of reach our potential? How do you get people working in their element? And if you can do that, then you can attach everything else to it. But if you rob people of their element, if you make them uncomfortable, if you make them afraid, if you make them fearful or whatever, and you tell them you've got to be educated, you've got to learn these sums, do your 10 times tables by
Yeah.
rote, whatever, is actually you're going to destroy for so many people the potential that they could have.
Hmm.
Whereas, and again, he speaks much better than I could ever do, but about these individual cases where people who, were generally thought of as of having real problems, psychological problems,
Hmm.
he suddenly says they then found their elements. They
Hmm.
then found the thing that they were good at, and suddenly their whole character emerges and their whole kind of benefit to the world emerges. And I'm just such a big, big believer in that. And I think it is what's driven me a lot in terms of the work that I do with kind of young and emerging artists and all the work that we've
Hmm.
spoken about is about trying to provide an environment where people can get into their element, where they can be the very best at something, and we can then help. I can then help them, fulfill that potential.
That's
Um,
amazing. It's so interesting to hear you talking about the impact of the things that he wrote and talked about in a very real way, how it's impacted on your work. I mean, another thing that really struck me about him, not even necessarily the content of what he was saying, but just the way he spoke. I mean, it was akin to stand up comedy. You know,
yeah, he's
his timing. He was
yeah,
so funny, such a
yeah,
great storyteller. Again, a bit like Dave Allen. Some of the
yeah, yeah.
stories he told were just so funny and had a real point to them.
Yeah. Well, he had that mischief, didn't he? So there was a real twinkle in his eye whenever he was telling stories, and he's got, as you say, it's a brilliant dry delivery where he gets his laughs, and the jokes are often the kind of throwaway right at the end of having said something incredibly serious, and then there's a
Hmm.
little acknowledgement at the end, and yeah, he's got a great, certainly. I'd be proud to have worked with him and prepared him for those TED talks that he's given,
Mm.
but they've resonated with so many people. So there is something he's doing in that relaxed, laid back style, talking about something that he was, immersed in. He was, he wasn't just somebody who had an opinion on this. He'd studied it. He's
Hmm.
doctorate within it and all these things. And yet he managed to make it every day. He managed to make it consumable and digestible for so many people. And I love that. And I say he
Yeah.
spoke straight to the heart as well. So I mean, one of the things that really struck me about all his work was about this notion of that you can, if you don't do this, what are you denying in people? And
Hmm.
without kind of oversharing, but my dad was of that generation that used to do the 11 plus.
Hmm.
And that there was that idea that when you left primary school, you took the 11 plus and you either went to grammar school or you went to the secondary modern. And for whatever reason, my dad's really intelligent. My dad's really, really bright, but he um, failed his 11 plus
Hmm.
and got put in the secondary modern school. And then, and it kind of set him on track. So still now, he's in his mid 70s. I think he's still damaged by that judgment that was made of him at 11 years old, that he almost considers himself to be, oh, well, I was never quite a grammar school kid. I was never quite that person. And it
Hmm.
was purely, I'm imagining anyway, that, that the exam questions that he was asked on that day just didn't suit him. But I just feel as though it's such a poor representation of people. I could talk endlessly about this, by the way, but
Yes.
I'm
Yeah.
no big fan of examinations. Certainly, I find things like league tables and this comparison and this
Hmm.
endless concern that we have of passing things. I just think, gosh, immerse yourself, do things, be involved with people. That's where the real learning takes place. And
Yeah.
for me, I was, my mum was a teacher, so but she was a math teacher, never taught at the school that I was talking to. But the one thing that used to really irritate me is I went to what was the community college in Whitby in our town,
Uh-huh.
and it wasn't a great school. I don't want to kind of do it down a great deal, but there was a lot of staff there that really annoyed me as a sixth former. That I had this passion for theatre and making work and doing things, and it just seemed to me that on every turn that they kind of wanted to put the stoppers on me. They wanted to kind of control and turn
Mm-hmm.
me into something that I really wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so at A level, I did maths and physics and design because I kind of thought that that's what I was meant to be doing,
Mm-hmm.
but I wasn't really engaged in that. It wasn't my element, as Sir Ken Robinson would say. And as a result, I really struggled at school behaviorally. So I was more interested in what was happening outside of school and doing my kind of theatre and all that, those kind of things.
Yeah.
But instead of acknowledging that and observing that and kind of nurturing that, I just got told I was bad. Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
I mean,
I
I
can
really,
relate to this more than you could possibly imagine, John. This is really, really fascinating, and I totally get it. It's so sad that Ken Robinson gave that kind of definitive talk in 2006
mhm.
about looking at the idea that there's more than one kind of intelligence,
Yeah,
and the absolute the imperative importance of recognizing creative intelligence and emotional intelligence as well, which I think
yeah,
is what you're talking about. And it's certainly something that he prized. But here we are in 2020, still having
mhm.
the same conversation 14 years later.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I mean, what do you think the lasting impact of his work is? It's not to say that because we're having the conversation 14 years later that he didn't make a difference, because he did make a huge difference in bringing these ideas to people.
Yeah. Well, I don't. I mean, I hope he's made a difference. I mean, I do think there was a period of time certainly where a lot of decisions at a kind of in our country at a kind of Ministry of Education type level, there was choices being made that were different. I have to say, I think we've gone backwards. I do think there is now this obsession again with examinations, and I think
Hmm.
one thing that again COVID has kind of highlighted is kind of exams are weird anyway. They're just such a weird way
Yeah.
of saying what whether a person is or isn't anything, and right now I feel for those youngsters at the moment who have either just come through their A levels or just about to be doing their A levels or GCSEs or whatever, um, and because it's not an even playing field,
No.
and what unfortunately the pandemic has done is made that discrepancy even wider, I think. And again, I just worry that testing people over a period of 3 hours after spending a lifetime learning about something is just not a particularly relevant way of assessing their suitability or whatever.
Yeah.
I think what in terms of what is left, is that his books and his articles and things have inspired a great deal of people. So you look at the numbers of people who've literally watched the TED talk that he gave on
Yeah.
the value of creative education, and I think that is having an impact. And what I know, I do quite a bit of work at the moment, work for, well, it's actually RADA Drama School, but doing their kind of corporate training. So I go
Oh
into
yeah.
organizations and speak to executives and kind of leaders within lots and lots of different organizations,
Hmm.
and this stuff is filtering through at that level. So the recognition that things like creativity, ingenuity, flexibility, and all those things really matter. I just worry that our kind of current education system, and this is something Ken was saying, is so behind the times. Is it was built at a time when we were kind of factory fodder, and that there was a kind
Hmm.
of industry and a way of doing things. I think modern life is so different to that. The skills that you need to survive as a human being now are all to do with resilience and flexibility and ability to make something out of nothing and all of that stuff. And that's what we need to be educating into our young people and our elderly population as well. So it certainly inspired me anyway, Connor.
Oh, and do you know, when you told me, or when you let me know who your guest list was, his was the name that I didn't recognize, and
Okay.
then I googled him, and it was, oh, it's that guy who's always going viral on social media. If you're
Uh,
on Twitter, if you're on Facebook, you will have seen a clip from one of his talks on the
yeah,
importance
yeah,
of education. It can't be understated how important it is to be
yeah, yeah.
seen, to understand what you're about. And is that something that really informs, and you do you actively think about all of those lessons when you are working with young people, be it through the
Yeah,
lab at Northwall and that kind of thing.
it does. And again, I think, oh gosh, it sounds like we're in therapy now, Connor, but I'm of an age where I say, again, I think you become more reflective. So I don't think I considered any of this through my kind of 30s and 40s, but I've just hit 50. And suddenly you sort of start to recognize probably I haven't got as long left as I've already done, type of thing. And you
Mm,
become a little bit more reflective. And very definitely, the one of the big things for me, and when I think back to my experience of, I say, coming from this little village, arriving in London, and suddenly being kind of exposed to these extraordinarily talented people and sharing their passion, and that driving me and giving me the impetus to start a career. But I was also kind of enabled to do that by a number of really gifted people. There's a guy called Ed Wilson, who was at the time the artistic director of the National Youth Theatre, and he was
hmm
just brilliant at recognizing that in people. He was brilliant at being able to sort of see, somebody who might be a little shy or a little bit uncertain, and bringing out of them a confidence. And he did it in such an unpatronizing way. So it felt nothing like being in school. It didn't feel like I was being taught, or it was
hmm
just a very different dynamic and relationship with adults and with the people who were there to kind of kind of coach or
hmm
mentor me in that way. And and so, yeah, that's very much something I carry with me. So I always, now, if I'm auditioning people or if I'm working with young people, is I always imagine, you know what do they need, what's going to kind of help get them through this? What do I need to provide in order to make them be able to articulate what the ideas that they need to express,
hmm
rather than it being a test or a challenge where they've got to overcome a hurdle? Actually,
mm.
just get rid of the hurdles, make it appropriate, make people feel safe and secure, and then extraordinary things start to happen. And yeah, so that's something I very definitely carry through my work. And
I think that
yeah.
sounds like Sir Ken would be delighted to hear that. I mean, if you've got him there at your dinner party and you have the opportunity to talk to him and ask him questions, what's kind of top of your list? What do you want to say to him or hear him talk more about?
Hmm. I don't know. I suppose it would be to do with this idea. So, I've mentioned again, my mum's a teacher, my sister's a teacher. I've worked a lot with young people, and I do
hmm
believe, um, what do we, leave with others, and what do we kind of, um, yeah, how does that um, leave people behind? I suppose, suddenly my mind jumped to that Philip Larkin poem of, they fuck you up, your mum and dad, and the idea that actually, as adults, as older people, we are having an impact on younger people, and that the things that we do and the things that we say make a huge difference. And I'm acutely aware of this as a father now of a 6 and 3 year old. Is, how do you bring out the best in people, and also protect them, and also make sure that they are prepared for whatever society is going to throw at them, and that they're not misbehaving in a restaurant, but that they are feel free and things. It's a
mm,
really difficult balance to find. But but I suppose that's what I'd be curious with Ken about, is what's his study taught him, because
yeah.
I haven't had the kind of done the studying and read the books and looked at the data that he's been had access to, and so I'd get kind of really forensic about some of that stuff, and
That's
hopefully equip myself and arm myself that if ever I do then meet an individual who tells me everything's about the exam and nothing else, that I'm able to go back on that person and say, well, actually, this is what you need to know.
I think a conversation with Ken would set you up very well to challenge that kind of idea. I
Yeah.
think you're already very well equipped to challenge it because you speak with the same kind of passion that I think I see in Ken when he talks about that. A fascinating, fascinating choice and a brilliant addition to your dinner party. Um, and your next guest is another incredible addition. She is an artist, singer, songwriter, and campaigner. She's potentially a controversial figure to some. She's certainly a very experimental artist who was at the forefront of the neo-Dadaist movement in the 1960s in New York. You're inviting the quite extraordinary Yoko Ono to your dinner
Mhm.
party.
Yeah. Well, I don't know where to start with Yoko Ono because again, I've never met her. I
Yeah.
don't know her, but I'm very aware and have been aware of her. As long as I can remember, all my life, if you
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
It's like everybody, the Beatles and the John Lennon, and as a result, Yoko and things were kind of in our consciousness and our cultural kind of
Mm-hmm.
land or whatever. I think the reason why I kind of invited to the dinner party is because more than just about anybody else in the world, I think she might have been totally misjudged and vilified in a way that I think is quite prescient today. Kind of like I think with the whole Twitter thing that goes on and things that I have real issues with of people being either wholly good or wholly bad. I
Mm-hmm.
think that happened to Yoko before any social media. And again astonished that she has maintained this extraordinary dignity throughout that vilification, whilst also holding on to the things that really kind of matter to her.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and again, I'm not going to be her biographer or anything like that. I'm no particular expert on her, but from the little I do know, that it's extraordinary that she, when um, her and John Lennon were together, he did the parenting and she looked after the business. So when they had their child, that it was Sean that
Mm-hmm.
John sort of took 4 years out to be the parent, and there's all those pictures of him carrying the baby and things, and
Mm-hmm.
Yoko was the one that actually put the business to rights and
Mm-hmm.
actually was really successful at doing that. So we were talking much earlier about this idea of the artistic and the executive, and how do you make, kind of a business out of the art and the art out of the business, and
Mm-hmm.
the conflicts that are therein. She was clearly a brilliant businesswoman who had a kind of, kind of an ability to make all that, kind of tick for him, and as a
Yeah.
result, the kind of estate is still worth what it's worth. Um, she also, like Björk and a couple of the others, is I think I quite like, and not that although my Prometheus Bound story is a bit avant-garde, I'm not really an avant-garde artist. I don't consider, the work that I do is often to do with, being really inclusive, allowing
Yeah.
people. I always, the test I give myself is if my grandma and my niece and my Uncle Stephen, who doesn't really know a great deal, were watching this, would there be a route in for them? you
Yeah.
know that's the work that I tend to make, and one of the reasons why comedy attracts me so much. But I don't think Yoko had that concern too greatly. I think she the work she wanted to make, that a lot of that kind of concept art is really, I mean, I find it hilarious, but maybe
Yes.
for the wrong reasons, a bit like my performance in a drama series. So I'm laughing at it, but when the artist is going, this is actually the most serious thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
But I do think, she did carry with her that, again, there seems to be a sense of humor. There is a real sense of humanity about her. So, um, you know, given that, I knew we were going to talk about it, and I suddenly thought,
Mm.
I don't really know much about Yoko Ono, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But so I listened to a couple of interviews, and she was talking about the bed-in that her and
Mm-hmm.
John did, and I didn't realize it was on their honeymoon, and they just kind of invited the world's press and the cameras to kind of come and witness it. And
Mm.
in hindsight, she was saying it was a pretty kind of odd, unusual thing to do, but actually what they were trying to do was celebrate, kind of talk about peace, the world peace. And I just thought, well,
Yeah.
you know, if you've got that kind of celebrity, if you've got that kind of traction, at least do something good, and I do think that's
Mm.
overwhelmingly what they were trying to do was make the world better.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting that the first thing you said about her was, I don't really know where to start, because I was the same. I was completely the same. I read as much as I could about her. I knew the small amount that I knew about Yoko Ono, having done a performing arts degree and having
Mhm.
studied Dadaism a little bit and neo Dadaism, I was aware of her kind of avant-garde work, and it is inaccessible, and depending on your viewpoint, it's just a bit weird.
Mhm.
A lot of people don't even really consider it art necessarily, but that's a whole other debate that we don't have time to have here. But
Yeah.
John Lennon once said of Yoko Ono that she was the world's most famous unknown artist. Everybody
Mhm.
knows her name, but nobody knows what she does. And
Yeah.
NME magazine went as far as to call her a no talent charlatan.
Uh-huh.
Um, I mean, that's not the case. Regardless of what you think of her work, she is a fascinating person in her own right, and in her art and in her music and in her campaigning.
Yeah, and I think that that would be important. Almost like I'd try and tell myself I'm not going to do when I'm speaking to Yoko is talk about the Beatles or talk about John. I
Yes.
want to kind of ask her and allow, find out what's happening for her and those things. There is, I mean, again, because obviously a lot of what we know about Yoko Ono does come through the lens, if you like, of John Lennon, and he was saying that when he went to that exhibition where he met her the first time, it was
Hmm.
one piece of work that he'd was sort of introduced to, which involved him getting on top of a step ladder, then putting a kind of magnifying glass and looking at really tiny writing.
Hmm.
And when he looked through that kind of lens, it said yes. And he
Hmm.
sort of said, well, at least that's positive. And it was that that kind of then prompted the conversation that led to them then, the kind of love
Hmm.
affair and the life that they spent together. And so I'm quite drawn to that, that I do think for all the oddness, I think there is a positivity to her. And I think, again, a bit like Björk, if you like, is that sense of looking at the world through a slightly skewed lens, through a kind of a different approach, I think is fascinating. And I like people of opinion. So, I think Dave Allen, Ken
Hmm.
Robinson, Björk, and Yoko would all have an opinion on things.
Yeah, you're
And
not
that,
short of an opinion there.
yeah, but that makes for a much better sort of dinner party. And I think if I'm guilty of anything, it's sometimes trying to second guess and trying to blend in and trying to fit in with people. And I think what
Mm.
I admire and what brings out the best in me is when suddenly I'm confronted by people who have really strong opinions. And that's when I'm then able to, the best comes out in me, if you like, because everything's up for grabs, anything can be spoken about. And that, to my mind anyway, makes for the most interesting conversations rather than much kind of blander, safer conversations where kind of everybody sort of agrees. And again, it feels
Yes.
very much like that with social media, doesn't it? That we kind of spend our times in these echo chambers where
Yeah.
we're all
Yeah.
basically agreeing or not, and there is none of that grey hinterland. And
Yeah.
I think Yoko would be really fascinating to talk about that. She's also,
Absolutely.
again, I mean, as a woman and as a kind of Japanese woman, I just think there's lots of things I could learn from her and how she's had to deal with a society and a place that where she's had to battle every last inch. And again, I think being pretty vilified
Yeah.
throughout, yet
Something that
maintain.
really struck me when I was reading about her and about John Lennon, there's obviously that whole kind of ridiculous thing that's been completely dismissed by everybody involved, including people like Paul McCartney. The idea that she broke up the Beatles, and she has been vilified for that. And as you said, she's been completely misunderstood as a result of that. And some of the hatred and acrimony that she came in for, she and John Lennon cited their main reason for leaving the UK and moving to New York was because of her treatment by the press in the
Mhm.
UK. And that is something we still see now. I mean, you look at Meghan Markle and Prince Harry leaving for the exact same reason. She has put up with so much crap from people that she
Yeah.
just didn't deserve.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is, it is racism, it is misogyny as well. There's
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
in my mind, there's no getting away from that. But, and I say again, I think, looking in, we're all potentially guilty of those things, but but I mean, the story of Yoko and John is at one of the a time in their relationship when I think they call it the lost weekend or something, where actually she said to him, "Go out. Clearly this isn't working for whatever reason at the moment. Go out and do what you need to do." And he kept, so I think he had some sort of affair with somebody, and then
Hmm.
came back and said, "Oh, no, I made a mistake. I want to be back." And she said, "No, not yet, not yet." And she sort of gave him all this space in order that then in his own way, he found a way of going, "No, you're the person that I want to be with." Now, again, I probably know more about John than I do Yoko in terms
Hmm.
of reading, but I think she kind of healed a lot of the anger that he'd been carrying for a long, long time because of that. Again, wisdom, compassion, that she allowed him. She really
Hmm.
absorbed and just yeah, suppose kind of really challenged in a very healing way some of his behaviors, and actually got him to accept some of the kind of frightful things that undoubtedly he had done in his past, and
Hmm.
and things that and again kind of made him better because of it. So yeah, I say I'm fascinated because I think out of all my guests I probably know least about her, but I just, yeah, I think she'd be a really
Yeah,
interesting person to have on board.
an incredible, incredible choice, and certainly someone who you just wouldn't have a dull moment hearing her opinions on things and the stories that she has to tell. A really great
Indeed.
addition, as indeed is your final guest. This person is just a creative legend, and I sort of don't use that term lightly at all. He was a phenomenal actor, and he was also just one of the most definitive musical artists of the 20th century. Indeed, Rolling Stone named him the greatest rock star ever following his death in 2016. You're inviting Ziggy Stardust himself, David Bowie.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was really surprised, Connor, because when we were talking, you said, well, no one's ever invited David Bowie before.
I
And I
know.
kind of
It's
thought he would
amazing.
be like the kind of number one go to, okay, well, I'll have Bowie and then try and find
It's
five
really
others.
interesting. There are about 3 or 4 people who I thought when I started this format, everyone's going to invite. And
Yeah.
yet nobody has invited Barack Obama. Nobody has
Okay.
invited Stephen Fry. And nobody has invited David Bowie to this point. It's amazing
Right.
to
Yeah.
me. But
Yeah. Yeah.
why are
Yeah.
you inviting David Bowie?
Well, so oh gosh, a couple of things. I mean, one, and I think there's a similarity between him and a couple of other of the guests. Is this? I think as a creative, as somebody
Hmm.
who understood that idea of creative freedom and exploring the thing that they wanted to explore and doing that with courage and honesty and skill and expertise. And if he managed to find an audience, great. If he didn't, he would continue that particular journey. And
Hmm.
I do really admire that, and I think it builds resilience into people. So, again, we've spoken a lot about kind of my work with young people, but I think we more than ever now we've got to build resilience into people, and I think one of the
Yeah.
best ways to get resilient is ask yourself why are you doing this, because it can't be about fame. Actually, it can't be about money. But if it is about a journey, if it is about a search for something, then you'll never fail. And again, it sounds like quite a trite thing to say, but I think it's so important
Yeah.
that is that there is this over reliance at the moment of that's successful, that's a failure, this is means that you're doing well, this means that you're not. I mean, comedy is one of the worst, I think, for this, is that
Hmm.
the kind of I've been backstage at some comedy gigs where it's vitriolic, the kind of anger that people carry when oh well, he's getting a laugh because he was on whatever the other day, and really a lot of resentment that's carried around. And I think one thing that Bowie seems to have managed is that he doesn't carry that. So he cites the Tin Machine as the time when he wrote some of his best songs. Now the fact that nobody else thinks that is by the by, because
Yeah.
he actually goes, well, no, for me that is actually, when I look at that song, that was one of my most successful songs.
Hmm.
But he didn't happen to find an audience, or a smaller audience, and other kind of projects that he'd worked on. So that's one thing. I think he's got that great quality, and I think it's a quality that any young creative could learn from. And I think, and again, I would learn from, as not such a young creative, but somebody who's, you know, longer in the tooth. But I think that would be one thing. Again, I also think he's very funny,
Yep.
and
Yeah.
and I think they all carry this kind of little twinkle in their eyes that just means that they can, I don't know, laugh at themselves a bit. I think you know, he doesn't, it seems to me anyway, take himself too seriously.
Mhm.
He always talked about his kind of personas, if you like, as they were clowns that he was presenting, and he was, kind of the work he did with, was it Lindsay Kemp, is it the mime artist and things. But I think he was really interested in the idea of clown and what a
Mhm.
clown could do, and how you can carry certain messages through the kind of lens of a clown. So I would find that fascinating. But also I think he's got extraordinary insight.
Yeah.
There's a clip on social media, isn't there, at the moment, around him kind of just as the internet was
Yeah.
kind of in, not even given birth yet, but just there, and he understood it completely. Understood the power of that it was going to have, and I think it's with Paxman or somebody like that. But
Yeah.
you
Yeah. An
see this
almost kind of
incredulity.
freakish level of forward thinking and vision,
Yeah,
where he pretty much described the emergence of a Spotify type thing and the impact it would have on music. And at the
yeah,
time, everyone was just thinking, no, no, it's email. That's all. It was
indeed, yeah,
really
yeah.
remarkable.
Yeah. Well, and I think, he has that quality that Björk has, as being slightly other in
Yeah.
terms of, I would say, he would say, from what I've read, that they were all performances. So that he's, whether it was Ziggy or Aladdin Sane or the Thin White Duke or whoever it
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
they were all just kind of clowns or masks that he put on.
It's
Um,
fascinating when he spoke about some of those characters, like Ziggy Stardust and Thin White Duke and that kind of thing. I mean, he immersed himself in them so completely that it
yeah,
got to the point where it actually became very detrimental to his like mental and emotional well being.
gosh,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
he
I
he
mean,
just so immersed himself in it. Like it's in a sense though, it's a quality in a creative that you would think a lot of actors would kill to be able to become that character so much.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you look at some of those pictures in that period, just between kind of young Americans and Station to Station, or that kind of Thin White Duke
Mhm.
period. And I mean, he looks ill, one, but
Yeah.
completely alien, and I think it was around that time that he was also accused of, almost this kind of slightly fascist sort of tendency,
Yeah.
and whatever, and that the character was sort of this person that was sympathizing in some way. And what I've seen him interviewed since that, and reflecting back on it, and him saying that that was really dangerous. He got
Mhm.
so immersed in that, and all the amphetamines and cocaine that he was taking alongside it, that kind of supported that character and took him to wherever that character was going to take him to,
Mhm.
but that actually it was a really dangerous place. And
Yeah.
again, it's another kind of thematic thing. I think that we're all of us have that potential in us. Again,
Mhm.
I'm not massively religious, and certainly not a kind of I kind of not fell out with the church, but I don't go to church any longer or
Mhm.
whatever. But
Mhm.
I am really curious about the kind of inner journey that people have, the sort of jihad or the battle that you have with yourself of what are the good bits, what are the bad bits, and how do
Mhm.
I manage that. Um, and yeah, I think he again seemed to understand that, and was willing to, go there and take it to its nth degree of experimenting with it, and
Yeah.
presenting a version of that in an artistic way that people could then identify with, which is what great artists do, don't they?
Absolutely. He's someone who every now and then on this podcast I have to ask the question because it's not necessarily relevant to everybody's choices of guests, but with someone like David Bowie, I think it is relevant about which era, kind of, at what point in his life would you be wanting
Mhm.
to meet Bowie? The earlier kind of Ziggy Stardust, Thin White Man, very experimental, but clearly very unwell, as you said,
Yeah, yeah,
version of Bowie. Fascinating creatively at that point in his life, achieving remarkable otherworldly kind of success.
mm.
But would you want to be
Well,
meeting Bowie
yeah,
with
well, I
the?
did meet him once.
Oh my
So
word!
so
Whoa!
this was I mean, and I don't know whether this was the right time to meet him or not, but, it was when I was at drama school, I went to see a Stephen Burkoff play. Burkoff was kind of very big in the late '80s, early '90s,
Yeah,
and it
yeah,
was about 1989, I'm guessing, around that time anyway. And he was doing a version of Greek, and it was a great play. And I really, it was a play that really struck with me. But it was in the West End, and it was quite expensive. But I managed somehow. I bought. I went to see it with the college, and then I went back to see it the following night, and then the next night I got in, but they'd and this play wasn't doing particularly well, so the upper circle wasn't sold, and somebody sort of said, "Oh, just go in there," and in there was David Bowie, and
oh
so
my
there was
god!
me and David Bowie watching this play, and in the interval, I sort of kind of had a conversation with him basically. One, he was really lovely and really generous. So, I think it was a bit odd in that we were both kind of trapped in that space, if you like. So he wasn't going to go downstairs and go into the bar because he didn't want to be recognized. There was
Sure.
nobody meant to be in that space. So it was a really precious time, I suppose, I had with him. For by the time I'd plucked up courage to say hello, we were sort of 5 minutes into the interval, I think. But we had a really nice conversation. He was really warm and really friendly and very funny and very charming. And then we sat back and watched the play. Then he disappeared, and that was it. But that was, kind of when you try and log that, he'd just come off, I think, the Glass Spider tour, which had been a huge commercial hit in terms of the money that it generated.
Yeah.
But he found it one of the most depressing times because he just felt like he was churning out units. He just felt like he'd lost his way as an artist
Hmm.
in some ways. And so that's kind of when I met him, was when I think he was getting recharged in that period at that point. So
Wow.
yeah, I don't
That
know. I mean,
is
yeah,
extraordinary.
he was yeah, and I think, I mean, I remember at school that the stuff that he did with Niles Roger, the sort of like, Let's Dance and China
Yeah.
Girl,
Yeah.
would be around the time that I might be kind of buying his records, and then it was after that that I got back into his kind of Ziggy and Aladdin Sane. But all my life, now I am just amazed at his longevity and his ability to reinvent and all the things that we know
Yes.
about Bowie. Do you know what I mean? It is extraordinary the way that he was able to keep that creative energy right up until the very end. So when he
Yeah.
the last album, Black Star, is just extraordinary work.
It's something that really separates, great artists from very good artists. Their ability to continue to be curious and to try totally different things and take huge risks with reputation and fan base and everything. And he probably more than anybody else exemplifies that. I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm saying that odd meeting that we had, he genuinely, Connor, was really generous. He was very warm. He was very, it would have been very easy for him just to tell me to f off, or what, you know what I mean, and just
Sure.
shut me down. But he
Sure.
really didn't. He was curious and he was questioning and he was asking, what I was doing there and how I ended up, exactly where it was and things. And it wasn't, I don't know, it was done without any sort of judgment or any of those things. And yeah, so and they're great qualities
Yeah.
to have at the party as well, which is, I would hope that all of my guests are able to articulate their position and have strong opinions, but they're also incredibly generous people that would welcome other people, and so it'd be a really balanced
I think
evening.
so, yeah. I think you've chosen really well, and I think those qualities absolutely do carry across. I mean, David Bowie, a whole other aspect to his just amazing, simply amazing creativity. Even if you took away the music, we'd be talking about an amazing actor.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
but he was both, kind of freakishly good at both.
yeah, yeah. Well, things. I mean, as camp as um, Labyrinth, but things like Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence.
Hmm.
That is a really wonderful, wonderful performance. The man who fell to Earth. You absolutely believe he's an alien from a different planet,
Hmm.
and all of that. So, yeah, I have a lot of, I say, a lot of time for him, um, in terms of what he left us with, or kind of what he gave us in terms of as performers. But would be fascinated to find out a little bit more about what drove that, and I think he would make, again, people feel comfortable about that. I think he doesn't strike me as a diva. I heard somebody, I think it was Rick Wakeman, who I think played the piano, didn't he, on Starman, or whatever. But
Hmm.
it's saying that in all his career, he's, again, never met anybody who more exemplified what it was to be a professional than Bowie. This
Mm.
idea of that he was incredibly, challenging in terms of wanting people to be at the top of their game, and if they weren't rehearsed and they weren't prepared, he wouldn't, he'd give them pretty short shrift. But
Mm.
also that when he had people working with him and doing things, he was incredibly generous with, and e- encouraging of those things. And again, that's a quality that I like, and that for me is, you know I think I've probably sounded like I'm, kind of all warm and lovely, but I'm actually really demanding that when I'm working with people, I want them to be good, to bring their best game, to be
Yeah.
challenged, to feel like they are doing their best. And then, it happens that I think a lot of young people, particularly in the creative industries, really appreciate that. Really appreciate not just
Yes.
doing something because they enjoy it, but doing something because it's a challenge, and because it's hard work, and because you've got to, bring your best version of you to it.
Yeah. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, Bowie is just one of the most fascinating people, and I mean, just so brilliant and kind of multifaceted in so many different ways. I mean, if you've gotten there at dinner, you mentioned earlier that perhaps Björk might be up for a bit of a sing song, and
Yeah,
I think everyone there would be. Is there a particular song or a particular part of Bowie's discography that you'd be hoping maybe he'd be amenable to giving a little performance at dinner?
I don't know. It depends. If it's windy outside, then I think it's station to station. That Wild is the Wind, and it's a really, sort of laconic, laid back track. But I really find that beautiful and evocative. And so if the kind of North York Moors was blowing up a bit of a kind of gale outside,
Hmm.
then kind of just listen to Dave Allen tell a ghost story, and then Dave David Bowie chimes in with a version of that. Might be quite good fun to be part of.
That sounds like quite some evening. I mean, just the whole thing. You've got Dave Allen, Björk, Ken Robinson, Yoko Ono, and David Bowie there in this amazing old blacksmith. You mentioned the kind of the fire and the equipment in the corner, and all we need to know now is you mentioned it might be useful for cooking, but what exactly would you be cooking on that
Yeah.
fire?
Well, we're probably going to spoil it all now for people, but I quite like the idea of kind of like that active cooking. The idea of, do you remember those? I think they were called Mongolian barbecues.
Oh, I'm
That
not
sort of.
familiar with
I
them.
don't know, okay, well, it was a bit of a. I think there was a kind of, appetite for it for a little while, and then for whatever reason they all disappeared. So it's probably a terrible idea, but where you were kind of given food in a bowl, and then you kind of put it on the barbecue, and you cooked it yourself,
Oh
and then ate it.
yeah.
Remember those things?
I'm
But I
familiar with them, yeah.
Well, I quite like that sort of thing. So I mentioned the, time in Tokyo. I was lucky enough to go to Tokyo once and got taken to this fantastic sushi restaurant, and the chefs sort of were in the midst, and you sat around and you watched them kind of prepare the food you were going to eat, and you had like a glass of sake between each and every course, and there's about 12 courses and a full bottle of sake drunk by the end of it. But there's something about the action of cooking and the activity of cooking that I think is both a great leveler and a great kind of way of communicating. Now, it could be that some people end up with half cooked bits of sausage or something. I don't know, but I think it'd be quite good fun. And again, I think there's something about it bringing people together. If we all have to kind of make it work, and I'm sure that there is something about, I don't know, baked potato even cooked on an open fire that tastes different from one out of a microwave. So I
Yeah.
think there is some kind of um, quality or taste that you get from it. Because I really enjoy food, so I don't want to sound like a heathen saying we're going to just barbecue everything. But at the same time, I think kind of cooking together, making a meal together, having kind of local produce and bringing a couple of eggs
Oh.
in from outside and all that kind of thing would be the where the fun would be had.
Oh, it sounds brilliant. So what would you be envisaging that everybody's cooking together? Is there a kind of specific menu, or would you kind of get to choose what you want to cook for yourself?
Yeah, we'd sort of see what happens, I guess. I mean, maybe I don't know. I'm quite good with a wok and a stir fry and that sort of thing. And again, I
Oh,
think on a really hot forge, you could probably get the heat up to a degree where you could make some really interesting sort of Asian dishes and things. So that might be something. Little, kind of a bit like a tapas type of thing where we're kind of nibbling a bit, chatting a bit, going back for a bit. And I say, we always know we're not going to run out of food. So there'll be plenty to feed us, but we don't have to be overfaced by it either. So it's not like too formal in that way.
yeah. Oh, it sounds absolutely wonderful. John, I mean, you've put together just one of the best dinner parties we've definitely had in the series. It's fascinating guests, and I mean, I could just talk to you for so much longer about them, but I've got to let you go and enjoy the rest of your evening now.
Yeah.
But thank you so, so much, John, for taking the time to chat. This has been so much fun.
Yeah. No,
Um,
well, likewise, Connor. I know at the end you because I've heard a couple of these before, and you say, "Oh, it's such a shame we can't now do it." But listen, it's
yes,
been a real pleasure. Just imagining it. There's a great, kind of bonus, I think, sometimes just imagining things, and then, maybe there'll be a version of that at some point in the future. So,
absolutely, yeah. Oh well, I'm so pleased that you got something out of it as well. I've gotten so much out of it, and it's been so lovely to hear about some of those kind of influences on your own creativity. I mean, the North Wall. I'm not just saying it because you're here. It's genuinely my favorite arts venue, kind of in the county that I go to. I love going to the North Wall. I was so privileged with Jericho Comedy to be on stage earlier in the autumn. It was such a pleasure to be there, and we're going to be back Jericho Comedy in hopefully in December. Certainly in 2021. We've got
yeah,
our Oxfordshire Mind Gala.
indeed, and you're so welcome. But you're right in terms of environments. We're talking about a dinner party and what environment, but
Yeah,
the North Pole is very fortunate in that it's such a beautiful aesthetic as a building, and it's surprising how many comics or musicians or performers come up to us afterwards and say, "Oh, God, it's a real pleasure to perform here,"
yeah.
and it's certainly a great pleasure to sit in the auditorium and watch work there. So, I do hope that people do kind of give us a chance and take a look.
Oh, 100%. Well, I mean, I obviously have a bias in trying to get people out to Jericho comedy shows, but I would say that yes, we've got our wonderful Oxfordshire Mind Gala on January 16th. We can't wait to be with you. But there's so many wonderful touring comedians who come to the North Wall, and it is my favorite place to go see touring comedy. I saw Susie Ruffle there a couple of years ago, and it was just one of my favorite experiences in a theater. It's such a brilliantly intimate venue, despite the fact that it seats a considerable number of people. It does have that intimate atmosphere of a 50 seater, which is a really difficult thing to achieve, and I think it does so well. So
No, you're
everybody get out to the North Wall, see what you can in 2021. John, you've described some great performances coming. Hawk is one that I'm 100% going to be coming along to see. And thank you so much again. We'll add links into the episode description for everybody to visit the North Wall and see all the tickets, see everything that's coming up. And John, I look forward to hopefully seeing you at the North Wall sometime very soon.
Indeed, Connor. Really looking forward to that.
Thanks so much, John. Bye-bye. That was such a fascinating chat with someone who I could easily have talked to for a lot longer. Such a brilliant insight into John's creativity there, and he so excellently explained why each of those people have informed or inspired him. Just a really great chat and such a lovely guy. Huge thanks to John for taking the time to speak to me. We've added links into the episode description for the North Wall's website and Twitter accounts. Do make sure you have a look at those. And if you're in Oxfordshire, you owe it to yourself to get out and see some shows there. It genuinely is my favourite performance space in Oxford. I've seen so many amazing shows there, and I've had the privilege of performing on the stage. It's just gorgeous. Check it out. We're approaching the end of the first series of the dinner party now, but you can go back and have a listen to all the previous episodes in the series. I have just loved every single conversation we've had so far on the show, and I've been so lucky to chat to such an amazing, creative, curious, funny, and passionate group of people. The Dinner Party is a Jericho comedy production. For all things Jericho Comedy, visit jerichocomedy.com or follow us on Twitter at ComedyJericho. And for more info on my radio, podcast, comedy, and writing work, visit connormcreynolds.com. I'll be back next week chatting to another fantastic guest all about their dream dinner party. But until then, thank you so much for listening, and bye-bye.